All right, we're just getting a little late start this morning, so apologize for that. For those that are visiting, we are in Genesis 25. We are dealing with Jacob and Esau. And for the rest of you, we are in lesson 5. So if you have your books, get one. Okay, we are live? Okay, good. And if you are visiting with us and you would like to get a book, in the foyer, we have these workbooks, and you're welcome to grab one. I believe we still have a number left. And so we are dealing in the book of Genesis, and we're trying to get the big picture of Genesis. And I want to, before we have a prayer and begin our Bible study, just to give you a big picture, we're going through the beginnings of the scriptures, and as far as this book is concerned. And one of the big things that we are seeing as we've been reviewing each week is how the promises of God that had been given originally to Abraham is playing out. And so we're transitioning from Abraham to Isaac. And in this moment, we are transitioning from Isaac to Jacob and Esau. And so that's kind of where we are right now without hitting everything that we've spoken about. So kind of keep that in mind, how the promise of God or the promises of God are being meted out or revealed to us in real time in Genesis. So with that in mind, let's go to our God in prayer and we'll begin our study. Dear Father in heaven, I come before you acknowledging your greatness. The fact that we can not just look at you as our God, but as Father. And we thank you for it. And I thank you for this morning, for the opportunity we are able to enjoy coming together, having the freedom to get through these doors and to freely assemble. I'm so grateful for this blessing. And I thank you for those who have called upon your name, who love you and love your truth and love the salvation that you have so sacrificially and freely given to us. And so I pray that we are moved by your love and will reciprocate it, learning from you how to love you better and to love our neighbor. So bless us, Father, as we continue our study in your word, that we can learn from these lessons of faith and even unbelief, that we can reflect upon our own lives and our walk with you, and to see our walk with one another, with those who have called upon your name as well as those who are not part of your kingdom. Bless us, Father, that we may live well before you in front of men, so that we can have a glorious calling fulfilled in our lives. I also pray that you'll be with us in our Bible study in Genesis this morning and bless us, Father, the things that we can learn from it. So thank you in the name of Jesus, our Lord and our Savior. Amen. All right. So part of it is going to be found in Genesis chapter 25. The other part, we're going to be reading out of Genesis 27 with a transition that I might or might not, depending on how things are flowing, get into a little bit of Genesis 26. The purpose is not to go through every chapter. The purpose is to go through some of these stories while highlighting the big picture in Genesis as it pertains to the story of man and his relationship with God and salvation. So that's kind of where we are right now. If you were to find some sub-themes based upon what you've read in this study in Genesis 25, is there anything that has stood out to you? Any sub-things? So big picture, story of redemption, but within it we have some other lessons and themes that might stick out. Has it stuck out to anyone in your reading and preparation for our study? Don?
How foolish Esau was
Okay.
to sell something very valuable
Yeah.
to something for hardly anything.
So for those that have not yet been prepared for the study this morning, in Genesis 25 and Genesis 27, you have, particularly in chapter 27, the story with the despising of his birthright, if you will. And as a result, he doesn't want to give up that which inherently belongs to him, which is, right, the firstborn status. How many of you can actually downplay Esau if, in fact, you were to look at it from his vantage point, saying, if I'm going to die, because those were his words, right, in chapter 25, if I'm going to die, what benefit does the birthright have to me? Right? My brother's going to outlive me. Dad's still alive. What good is a birthright to me if I can't take advantage of it? And so that was his thought, not realizing that he's going to live to see another day, and in fact, years from now. He was just hungry. Some have said that he was, not just hungry. You know, like for us, if we're hungry, what do? Like you're hungry right now, and it's going to take forever to cook a meal. I'll go to McDonald's. Yes.
Your brother's going to do that.
Yeah. What's that?
Do you really think your brother's going to hold that to you?
Right. Yeah. Who's thinking that way?
Their brother.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the one hand, it's like, I'm hungry right now. Number two, they don't have the means that we have, the modern means. There's no refrigerator to go get your food and everything. You have to go out and hunt for it. If you're really worn out, famished, how easy is it to go hunting when you're starving? And to us, when we're starving, that comes after how many hours of not eating? And we're starving to death. Okay, so there's some levels here that we may not be familiar with culturally, and that maybe he really is so famished and we cannot comprehend it. Maybe it's been days since he's eaten. We're not giving all that context.
Next we could bring this home to us. Sometimes we may sin, and that would be the moral suit in this heaven.
Yeah. So, here's the thing, right? We're talking about the picture here of despising your birthright. We're not necessarily equating what he's saying with he's going to lose out on his salvation. That's not what the story is about here. What we are saying is, where does the promise continue through? Right? That's the big storyline that we're getting, right? The idea was with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah had been barren. Wondering, where's the promise going to come through? And we know eventually comes through Isaac. Now, Isaac, of course, we're going to do the reading and we're going to pick up on some of this. Isaac, how many years before he has a child? 20 years. That's a long time. And so finally, he's praying to God with regard to Rebekah. And again, I'm jumping ahead of the reading right now, but he is able to have. So she's been barren for about 20 years. That's a long time. So again, the question mark is, who's the birthright going through? And these stories are like pictures that we get into the relationships among brethren in this case. But the big picture, where's the promise going to come from and through whom, if you will? And then now with the storyline of Esau and Jacob is some sub-themes that we're really picking up on.
Personally, I think you're being a little bit harder on the lifestyle there than it really was. They obviously had food available because they could go out and make the porridge. How many times have we read about, especially in Abraham and the wealthy folks, they had livestock everywhere. Go out and kill the fatty calf and you're eating it a couple of hours later kind of stuff. You're not going out and hunting for days to get it. So, I really think Esau here is really just not thinking at all.
Well, let's read the passage here because, in fact, he's not getting one from the livestock. He's actually going to go out and hunt game, right?
But that's his lifestyle.
Yeah.
Not the family's lifestyle.
Okay. So, and therein lies, right, where if I may be too hard, I would just get this for Ray's sake. Even if I'm an expert hunter, you have to go out, go hunt, come home, kill the fatted calf mindset, if you will. How long does it take to dress the animal? How long does it take to prepare the fire? How long does it take? And that you may have servants, and the servants can help you, and there may be ways to expedite it. But it's not the same thing as I'm going to go to Food Lion and go get me some steaks and slap it on the grill, right? And the reason why is this whole thing is taking place while mom and brother is going to be scheming, and having this plan and fulfilling the plan where he's cooking. And that's taking some time. So while he's cooking, preparing for his dad, then brother's out here hunting for game. And so timing and everything like that. Ted?
The point is not whether there was food readily available to Esau, which in camp, where they were encamped, I'm pretty sure there was.
Sure.
The point is, he counted as of no value what was probably of most value to him.
Yeah.
A meal versus the birthright. is a ridiculous comparison.
That's what
He
Don
made
was
it
making. Yeah,
ridiculous.
Don was making that point about the birthright. Yeah, and again, we have the clarity of hindsight to talk about the value right there. When you're in the middle of life, sometimes it gets distorted because you're looking at things from, hey, listen, if I die, what value is this? So you're looking at things from that vantage point versus we are looking at things backward, looking upon his life going, oh, come on now, Esau, right? Okay, go ahead, Jordan, and then Jesse.
Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of both, right? But it goes to illustrate how desperate he was. I think for me, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a crazy comparison to say I give this for that, but it goes to show in his mind in that moment, how desperate he was for something that he felt he could not gain before his death.
How many times have we looked at life in decisions we have made on the front side and see the justification, the mindset, and then when we look at things from an outside looking in perspective, where we have clarity, that we're going to go, oh yeah. Brother, how many of us have done that? Yeah, of course. So again, not to be so easy or to be so hard on anyone, trying to get big pictures and understanding it from God's vantage point, from our Bible study vantage point, from someone who's living life in the moment's standpoint. There's a lot of vantages or vantage points that we can see decisions being made from. Hopefully we can relate to all of these points of view that we have. I think, Ray, you had something else you wanted to add? Okay. All right. So let's read that since we jumped so far ahead. I didn't mean to do that, but let's read verses 24 through 34 of Genesis 25 as according to the reading in the book that we have. So Genesis 25, beginning in verse 24. Speaking of Rebekah, yes. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, and he was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with the same red stew, for I am weary." And therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." And Esau said, "Look, I am about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" Then Jacob said, "Swear then to me as of this day." And so he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, and then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. And thus Esau despised his birthright. So we've got this picture of their birth. And from the very beginning, in the reading, the way the author has written this out, you're seeing tension, right? What was the tension in birth? Yeah, here's a picture now, a baby. Biblically, we talk about children, before they know to do good or evil, the picture is as if there's this fight or this struggle of some sort, where one is grabbing the heel, as if a baby understands exactly what it's doing. But the author has a picture that it's being drawn for us of tension and struggle. And so that's the beginning that you have. And the very next story you get is the next struggle between brothers. Ted?
There's a previous beginning, because Rebekah is told by God.
Yes, absolutely right.
The older will serve the younger.
Yeah,
And
you're
that's
right.
and that she knows that.
Yeah.
So, kind of make me wonder, has God set up a situation where these people are going to scheme? Of course he hasn't, but the people, being imperfect, did.
Yes, absolutely.
And by the way, Hebrews calls Esau a godless, immoral person.
Yeah, I mean, that's a picture of what he is setting forth as a template. I just wasn't getting into the judgment aspect of his soul, if that's what you're alluding to. I'm talking about the idea that you have people living their lives, and we get to have the author's perspective about where this seed is going and where that seed is going. And that's a story of the Bible. It's showing us where the promise is coming from and through whom, if you will. And that's what we're seeing play out right here. Jesse?
Something I thought of earlier when we were talking, about why Esau sold his birthright. To me, I see an analogy of temptation in general, really broadly speaking, because in the moment, whatever thing that we desire because of whatever situation we're in, we sell ourselves out with enmity with God. In that moment, whatever that thing we're fixated on is more important to us than the big picture, which we know, but we cast aside. I mean,
Yeah. In fact, to your point, where's the first story that happens? In the garden. Yeah, in the garden. That's the first time you see that. When you justify your decision making in the moment, here's this fruit. It's good to the eyes, good to eat, able to make one wise. Yeah. Or when you are Cain. All right. This is the way God's treating me. This is the way God's treating my brother. If I get my brother out of the way, maybe I'm in better standing with God. I mean, however you justify life, you can make those decisions and realize, hindsight, that was a bad decision, right? And that's what we're seeing. For as godless as Esau is, as Ted is rightfully bringing out, did God still bless Esau? Absolutely. Look, just when we get to the end of the story, Genesis 35, 36, remember, Jacob is coming back to see Esau. Jacob is afraid of Esau. And how does Esau treat Jacob? Is he really going to kill him? Because that was the last thought we had of Esau toward Jacob before Jacob fled. When he comes back, what does Esau do? Gracious, open arms, if you will. And what does he say when Jacob has all these gifts for him? Yeah, he did not want to accept him, right? Although Jacob did give it to him, but he did not want to accept it. He said, because God has blessed me so much. And so there's a lot here. It's not just this black and white, easy to come up with, because life doesn't work that way. But big picture, we get to see exactly what Ted is talking about. Esau's life, godless. Without going too far deep into it, why was it godless? Aside from despising his birthright, what else did he do? Intentionally. Just to get under mom and dad's skin. I'm going to go marry some Canaanite women. This is what makes mom and dad happy. I'm going to make mom and dad upset. Right? Not honoring your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise concept, if you will. So there's a lot here that is playing out for us. And what you're seeing as a big theme in this story that has already been playing out in the narrative, we already saw from Genesis chapter 4, and that is a struggle among brothers. Right? And this story is going to continue to play out in the following generations as well. Tension among brethren. And then we're going to see this reconciliation among brethren as well. So there's a lot at stake. Any comments or questions, Brad?
To further your comment about the black and white, we tend to see things in black and white. Jacob is not some paragon of virtue here. He is not, they're scheming with his mother against his brother.
Right.
And if your brother comes in hungry, why wouldn't you just give him food?
Exactly. So those are some of the things that we kind of were touching upon last week in preparation for today, was that very concept of, like, if we're talking about Jacob as a template of faithfulness, what kind of template would we have? Pretty sad looking template, right? Because Jacob is a deceiver, and we see it right here. So the story, the author is showing this hand struggle against his brother. This author is showing, here's the very first story that you have, and he's deceiving his brother. And then you're going to also get it where you can even ask the question, pose the question, when Jacob finally goes to be with his relatives in the land of Ur, the Chaldeans, right? When he goes to Laban's, how does he behave there with the sheep of his relative? So there's question marks. And he can say, well, here, God was seeing my affliction. This is the way God dealt with me. But you can look at things from a human perspective and see how Jacob was even being deceptive there. These question marks. It's not all simple all the time. So very, very, very clear that he is not, as you're saying, the paragon of faith. Don, were you going to add anything?
I was just saying, he got deceived down the road himself.
Yeah, he did, didn't he?
He got a little of his own medicine.
That happens. So, yeah, we're seeing that play out. So, go to the next reading so that we get this big story that the author wants us from this book perspective is giving to us. So, we passed chapter 26. Isaac is in the land with Abimelech, and, you know, everything is good. God is blessing Isaac. He's growing his wealth, if you will. Isaac has to dig some wells and everything, but bottom line is God is always with him. They make a covenant, so on and so forth. And we pick the story back up with Jacob and Esau in chapter 27 now. So chapter 27, beginning in verse 1 says, that it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim, or so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau his older son and said to him, my son. And he answered to him, saying, here I am. And then he said, behold, now I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore, please take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Now, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to Esau his son, and Esau went to the field to hunt game and to bring it. So Rebekah spoke to Jacob her son, saying, indeed, I heard your father speak to Esau your brother, saying, bring me game and make savory food for me, that I may eat it and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me from there 2 choice kids of the goats, and I will make savory food from them for your father, such as he loves. And then you shall take it to your father, that he may eat it, and that he may bless you before his death. And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, look, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth-skinned man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to him to be a deceiver. And I shall bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. But his mother said, let your curse be upon me, my son, only obey my voice and go get them for me. One of the things that really stood out in chapter 25 was not only the distinction between Jacob and Esau, and you see some character, but even between Isaac and Rebekah and how they viewed their children. We had favorites, right? And fan favorites is a new theme that's taking place here from a human standpoint, right? Because on God's standpoint, with Cain and Abel, God preferred Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. In this situation, and we know God is different than man, but in this situation, we have now a father preferring one child over another and a mother preferring one child over another. And this theme is continuing to grow out further on because we see later on Jacob doing the same thing that his dad did, preferring one son over the others, right? I mean, who was Jacob's favorite son? Joseph, coat of many colors, right? So we're going to see that theme playing out. How important is the theme of how a parent is looking at their child playing out in this story? Huge. My son, go do it. I love you, by the way. And the author's made it very clear. He loves Esau. Go do this for me so that I may bless you. Wife is hearing it because of her love for Jacob over Esau. She wants her son that she loves to receive the blessing. So go deceive dad. Go deceive your brother. That's what Rebekah's role is in this, it seems to me. And of course, Jacob is pretty concerned for himself because why? He might get caught, right? I mean, Esau's hairy, I'm smooth-skinned. He's a hunter, I'm not. I mean, dad's going to know who it is that brought forth this game. Well, Rebekah knows how her son cooks food for dad, and so she's like, let me take care of it. let your curse be on me, right? So that's kind of where we are. We're seeing this tension building. And the question that we're having as readers is to note, okay, now, where is the promise going to play out, right? Because we know from the previous story that Esau gave up his birthright. What is that going to look like now that there's a blessing coming? So that's the mindset you should have as a reader going into this reading. So if we could just go through all of these things, I want you to look on page 51 in your workbook. It says Dr. John Sailhamer, Hammer, very noted as a Hebrew scholar. I love that this author of this book uses this quote on page 51 because it's a very astute quote that is given. Notice in the middle of the top paragraph on page 51, it says, Sailhamer believed the struggle between Jacob and Esau was indicative of a broader theme that flowed throughout Genesis, the struggle between brothers. Other examples of this include Cain and Abel, chapter 4, Ishmael and Isaac in chapter 21, the sons of Jacob in chapter 37. Nevertheless, he wrote, out of each of the struggles, God's will was accomplished. The point is not so much that the struggles were necessary for the accomplishment of the will of God, but rather that God's will was accomplished in spite of the conflict. So for us to take a step back, if you will, we are in the middle of a summer series, with the men that are coming on Wednesday nights on prayer and providence. And how do prayer and providence work in with this story right here? Based upon what Sailhamer had just said. Sailhamer is saying, listen, God is able to work through man's decisions and struggles. Despite their decisions, God can see that his promise is going to happen this way. For instance, Rebekah, as Ted was pointing out, was praying to God and asking for her being barren to receive a son, just as Isaac had prayed for her. What's happening in my womb, she's saying. And God is saying, there's two nations struggling in your womb. Right? And ahead of time, before they're even born, God is showing who is going to have the promise through. Right? Before Esau and Jacob are born, what does God say to Rebekah?
The younger is going to serve the older.
Exactly. That's a crucial line. The younger is going to rule over, or the older will serve. However you want to package it, that's the picture that is given. And that's contrary to culture. Culture says that the firstborn gets everything. God is saying, I'm telling you, I'm making this plan and it's going to be fulfilled. Even through the decisions that are being made. They're not puppets on strings. They're living life with their own sovereignty, as limited as it may be, making decisions, and God is working through them and even despite their decisions. He's still making things happen. And so you're talking about providence taking place, prayer taking place, and God mending and working divinely through all of this in ways that I don't even know how to explain. But that's what we're seeing here. And so again, as Sailhamer is saying, God's will was accomplished in spite of the conflict. All right. So any other thoughts as we're looking at this picture between Jacob and Esau? Anything standing out? Patty?
I'm sure this is not important, but is this birthright, do everyone know now what Esau and Jacob did? Was that a
great
private
question
thing, or?
The way I'm reading the text here in chapter 27 is that Isaac does not know what's going on. That's the picture I get. And I could be wrong. I don't know if there's any evidence that would show otherwise. Guys, chime in if you want to. But I get the picture that Isaac does not know about the birthright situation. Maybe Rebekah does. Maybe. Because of what she says to Jacob. So I don't know. So any other thoughts, guys? Want to add in?
I don't think he even cared. I mean, at this point in time, he had his favorite, and he knew which one was the oldest as far as he was concerned, and he was going to do, and he knew that God would speak to
So
him.
if he knew, he didn't care, because the oldest should get it, number one, if I can think humanistically, culturally, everything. And
It's just like,
yeah, and he's the child that I love.
Are the blessing and the birthright one and the same?
It goes hand in hand. Yeah, it goes hand in hand. I mean, this theme of birthright and everything, of the firstborn receiving a lot, that is very, very crucial to culture.
I was going to say, the birthright, as far as I know, is simply the double share.
Yes.
So in this case, you're getting 2/3 and 1/3 split, which is some dollar value there, but the blessing is the key part of it. That what's really interesting is that it can't be revoked even though there was fraud involved.
Right? And also, we're adding in, it's not just a monetary thing, this is the lineage, the family lineage. That's huge. It's coming through this line versus that line. So that plays a large part. Max and Jesse?
Yeah, I was just reading about blessing and birthright. I looked it up, and the blessing is kind of like leadership. I think respect as far as head of the family, and so the birthright, like Ray said, is, what I read is like a double portion of the inheritance, whereas the blessing is kind of like the acknowledging to the world that this is who we're passing it.
Yeah. And to just for delineation purposes, if you have multiple sons, half of it goes to your firstborn, the other half goes to the rest of your sons. Right? It's not divvied out. That's my understanding. Firstborn gets half of everything. The rest of all the sons, in this case, you just have Jacob. So Jacob would have gotten as 1/3, and Esau would have gotten 2/3 in that case. But let's say with Joseph, you're seeing great portion difference. So there's some cultural things there that play a part. But the bottom line is, where's your lineage coming through? And that's real crucial.
Yeah, there's two odd things that I see in all of this. One being that, Jacob and Esau were practically twins, so delineating an older versus a younger to us in our modern context is kind of comical to me. But the other thing, along Ray's point, is the spirit of the law versus letter of the law. His intent was to give the blessing to Esau. So it's amazing to me that can still hold, like Ray said, even though that's not at all his intent to give the blessing to Jacob.
Yeah, again, so we're not given all the information because the author wants us to go down this path with him. But to our questions that we ask about the cultures and everything like that, the reality is, Dad is wanting Esau to be blessed. That is abundantly clear in this passage. And yet, as man has things set on his heart, what does God do? He steps in with his sovereignty, right? He had already stated to Rebekah before the children were born, the older shall serve the younger. And so we're seeing this playing out about God's will, regardless, right?
Well, jumping way ahead, as you go through the lineage, a lot of the times the oldest is not the one that has the lineage passing through down to Christ. Repeatedly, and from my studies in the past, it's really because of the behavior of the people involved, like Jacob's sons. when you go through the list and they kept on doing all these bad things, the opportunity kept on passing down to a younger brother. But quite often, somebody besides the oldest is the one that ends up with that lineage.
Yeah, which is, again, contrary to the cultural way of things happening. So that lets us know God is in control. That's the reality of what we're seeing here. Through these stories, God is in control to see the promise that he had originally given to Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses, chapter 15, chapter 17, chapter 21, and again through Isaac in chapter 22, and again in chapter 25. There's a lot of this playing out, this theme, this thread, with regard to who the blessing of the promise is coming through, and ultimately leading to our Savior, Jesus. So, yeah, very, very good points to make, guys. Anything else? All right. I want you to look at the discussions on page 56. What is the main point of reading these sections in chapter 25 and chapter 27? What do you think is, not the author of this book, by the way, what do you suppose is God's desire for us to learn through these 2 chapters?
He's in control.
Absolutely. Again, we're talking about his providence leading us to the promise, right? How does God make things work despite our choices that we have? because we have the blessing of free will. And the blessing can mean I can choose God, I can reject God. I mean, I could even, in choosing God, I can choose God in my fleshly ways, right? Thinking that what I'm trying to do, I'm going to have a child, Ishmael, with my wife, and we're going to fulfill God's promise. I can make those kinds of choices, and God's stepping in and saying, no, I'm making these things happen because this is my promise through you to mankind. And so, yeah, God is in control. That should be the biggest takeaway. Anyone else? Ron? He sure doesn't, right? But he's working with mankind that he has made. Again, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we're made in his image to be able to do on earth what his will is from heaven, right? That we have a sense of sovereignty, that he says, I want you to have dominion over the birds of the air and the fish of in the sea and over the land animals and what have you. I want you to bear my image. And so we're seeing it play out here. So, but he certainly doesn't need our help. He actually, sometimes we get in the way, as we're seeing here in scriptures. Ron?
The providence of God, things don't work out like we look at and think, well, that's not right. It's right.
Yeah.
And God keeps his promises no matter what, and to whom he makes promises. Because back in verse 20, chapter 25, they insert in there that he fulfilled his promises to Ishmael.
Yeah.
And it was the starting of a great nation for Ishmael. So God's purpose is going to be fulfilled no matter what we may think or what we may have chosen.
Yeah.
He's going to do it. And you know, I think sometimes I don't get the big picture. Why were these people chosen? And it was for one purpose. And I think even today, they don't understand that purpose of why they were chosen. It's to bring the Messiah. And he wanted that lineage. And
Yeah.
he had a hand in it.
And about 2 or 3 weeks ago, to your point, Ron, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were talking about the difference between when we're talking through God's will and man's will, that when we choose or make certain decisions, it may be in line of God's will for the promise of the coming Messiah, not necessarily for if they've rejected God from that standpoint, that was a rejection to the point where they lose their soul, because that was not the intent of the author. So that when we're dealing with predestination topics and what have you, we have to understand that in light of the reality, because otherwise we're going to say, well, if it was God's will, then we are nothing but puppets on strings. But we have free will, and God can still providentially work his promises out despite our interjections that we make and choices that we make. He works through them. He doesn't need us. He can work despite our choices.
And they don't have to be flawless.
Correct. Yeah. Well, we're definitely seeing that, right? We're seeing very flawed men that he's chosen to work his promise through.
You've been preaching about that about us.
Yes.
We're chosen, but there are flaws.
Yeah. We still live in the flesh is the point. Yeah. Ray?
Just sitting here thinking about all this, through the patriarchal age, we never really read anything about God coming back to the people and saying, what were you thinking?
Right.
But when you move into the next age, that becomes very common. Moses and striking the rock, there's consequences. The Israelites, as they believe God, there's consequences. Saul, there's consequences. So there starts becoming consequences for these actions that we're not seeing now.
Interesting that you bring that point out, because there are times in which you see consequences, and there are times in which, despite those consequences, are still the blessings. Like, for instance, consequence of David's sin with Bathsheba, loss of his son, right? But yet, how is David blessed? Continues to serve as king. His kingship was not taken away from him from that vantage point.
But he didn't get to go to the temple.
Correct. He did not.
Because of some of those
Because of the
actions.
bloodshed that he was in his household, himself having. But yet, how is he viewed in Scripture? A man? My goodness, it's confusing. It can be confusing from that vantage point. But when we see the big picture, we should see it clearly. Despite our flaws, as Ron, you're pointing out, God still works through our choices.
He knows the heart, and that's the difference between us and him.
Yeah.
We don't.
Absolutely. Good comments, guys. So interesting, the discussion question number 2 is, how is Esau's decision to sell his birthright similar to the sin of fornication? Don?
The point I tried to make earlier,
Exactly, I agree.
we enjoy pleasure momentarily with eternity lost.
Absolutely. I think, and that therein lies the point that is often made from our vantage point, because we see like, he was not able to see the big picture. Well, because he's living in the here and now. I'm going to die, at least I think I'm going to die. I might as well go ahead and get this meal, because this birthright does me no good if I die. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we don't see the big picture because we're not God. And that happens a lot, right? we're hardly ever like God. And so we try to image after him, but our decision makings are still filled with a human vantage point. So the final question: what can families do to avoid displaying favoritism? Because even though that's not the main point of this story, it's a huge point that we're seeing playing out in future generations, where you can have favoritism. And what happens when favoritism takes place? If I play favorites with one of my 7 kids, what do you suppose happens with the other 6? That's the story that we're seeing when we get to Jacob with Joseph, right? The jealousy of brothers. The jealousy is a huge, huge point. And you're actually seeing it play out in this storyline right here, right? So what can families do to avoid this? And there's the template right here. John and Kim Biles, everyone. So I love your answer. That was quick. Supposedly we're not as thoughtful as John, and we have 7 instead of 1. What do you do? What's that? You think? Okay, now we're thinking. What do we think?
Just think of what's going to come and the consequences.
Yeah, what happens if we do play favorites? How is this going to play out, right? Those are some good, important questions to be had. Even though that may not be the intent of the story, we're seeing consequences of favoritism playing out. Don and Leslie? It is hard.
You really have to work at it.
Yeah. I mean, we have people with different interests. Isaac loved the hunter in his son. Rebecca loved the docility, I don't know how you even would say that, with Jacob. And I mean, that's not wrong, right? Having similar interests to certain parts of your family members, that's not wrong. But where does it go south? When you take the interests, and it goes to a part where you are partial against another, where it hurts that relationship. So those are some things to consider within the context of the story that may not be a part of the story here, but we can kind of bring into application for us today. And Leslie.
The other thing I pick out of here is that Isaac and Rebecca were doing from 2 different things. They were not working together. It was like my way and my way instead of our way. And apparently they didn't work it out between 2 of them first.
They weren't on the same page, and it showed its difference and its ugly head here.
If you don't have a united front, then you're doomed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's more things. Brett, were you going to say something? Okay. Yes.
Well, I think, too, you can see in this story that the will of God is still going to be carried out, because Isaac knew that Jacob was supposed to be the one who this was carried through, and yet he still went against the will of God. He did not set his family up for success in this story. And so he ended up, having all of these issues. And so it's like, you can still try to take control of that and think that you're going to do it the way you want to do it, but the story you keep seeing over and over is the disruption that God is showing, like, I'm going to have my way in your life. You can do it the easy way, or you can do it the hard way.
Yeah.
And so, they weren't on the same page. They did not, follow the will of God, or even look at they were asking the will of God in these things.
Yeah.
And so it's Jesus and God, it's still going to happen what he wanted it to.
And interesting, because Jacob's no better than Esau in what he's doing, but God is going to be working through Jacob's life, because he's going to be the one chosen through whom the promise comes. Yeah, what we're seeing is God is sovereign overall. So thank you, guys. Great comments, great statements made in Bible class, and hopefully we'll have a great worship to our Lord this morning.